All right, let's just get right into it. You've got these huge dreams, right? You want to build a business, get into incredible shape, maybe even make a dent in the universe. The vision in your head, it's crystal clear. But then, the alarm goes off, and that fire you felt last night just isn't there. You find yourself scrolling on your phone instead of actually starting. If this sounds even a little bit familiar, then you're in exactly the right place.
You know, this feeling, this weird paradox of having massive ambition, but what feels like zero day-to-day motivation, is so common. It's that frustrating gap between the person you imagine yourself becoming and the things you actually do every day. But listen, you're not broken, and you are definitely not the only one feeling this way. So, what is actually going on here?
And this is the whole game changer. According to entrepreneur Yomi Denzel, we've been looking at this completely wrong. This has nothing to do with being lazy or not having enough willpower. It turns out you've just been caught in a series of invisible, neurological traps that are killing your motivation before you even get a chance to start. So let's break them one by one.
Okay, so our first mission is to actually see these chains. We have to go inside the brain and understand how inertia, dopamine, and even our own identity are holding us hostage. Because once you can see them, you can start to dismantle them. The first chain is just a basic law of physics, inertia. An object at rest wants to stay at rest. I mean, think about it. The absolute hardest part of going for a run is just putting on your shoes. The hardest part of writing an essay is opening the blank document. We have this mistaken belief that we need motivation before we can act, but it's a total opposite. Action is what creates motivation. The trick is just to get moving, even in the smallest possible way.
So how do you actually break that inertia? With this beautifully simple technique, the 2-minute rule. It lowers the barrier to getting started so much that it's almost impossible to talk yourself out of it. You want to go for a run? Okay, just put on your shoes and walk outside for 2 minutes. That's it. Need to study? Just open the book and read one single page. Because what happens is, after those 2 minutes are up, that initial friction is gone, and you'll probably find that you actually want to keep going.
All right, let's talk about the second, and maybe the most powerful, chain of them all, dopamine. We usually think of dopamine as the pleasure hormone, but that's not quite right. It's really the motivation hormone. It's the chemical that drives you to get up and do things. And, well, our modern world is basically waging an all-out war on our dopamine system.
And here is the absolute core of the problem. Our brains are getting completely flooded with these unnaturally high levels of dopamine from stuff like social media and junk food. You know, this wiring wasn't a mistake. For our ancestors, seeking high-reward things like calorie-dense food was literally a survival mechanism. But today, that same system gets hijacked. It desensitizes our dopamine receptors. So when it's time to do something difficult but important, like studying, our brain literally goes, this is boring. Let's go find a quick hit of something interesting instead.
So the first solution is kind of a hard reset, a dopamine detox. By just starving your brain of these super high stimulation activities for a couple of days, you allow your receptors to become sensitive again. It's kind of like when I used to go to my grandmother's house where there's no Wi-Fi. Suddenly that boring book on the shelf becomes totally fascinating because it's the most stimulating thing in the room.
Now, if a full-on detox sounds like a bit much, you can try something called dopamine loading. The whole idea here is to structure your day to protect your motivation. You start with the hard stuff in the morning when your dopamine receptors are at their most sensitive after a night of sleep. Then, you save the phone scrolling and the video games for the evening, using them as a reward after the important work is done. You just can't start your day with a dopamine flood and expect to have any motivation left for the things that really matter.
The third psychological chain is the most personal one of all, your identity. Your brain is literally hardwired to act in a way that's consistent with who you believe you are. So, if you've spent years telling yourself, I'm just a lazy person, or I'm a procrastinator, then guess what? When things get tough, your brain will just follow that script and give up.
So how in the world do you change that? Well, think of your identity like a balance scale. Every single time you use the 2-minute rule to start working, you add a tiny little weight to the discipline side. Every time you choose to do some deep work before checking social media, you add another one. These small wins, repeated over and over, slowly start to tip the scales until your default self-image isn't lazy anymore, it's discipline.
Okay, so understanding these chains, that's the first half of the battle. But honestly, knowledge without a plan is just interesting trivia. So now that we know why our brains fight us, let's build the daily system to fight back, using a really practical framework from creator Kaizen Lane.
The entire system, the whole thing, starts with one simple, powerful number that just cuts through the chaos of endless to-do lists. And that number is 3.
This is called the rule of 3. The night before you go to bed, instead of listing out everything you could do, you force yourself to prioritize. You ask, what are the 3 things that, if I get them done tomorrow, will have the biggest positive impact? Those become your missions for the day. And our brains are just wired for this. We think in 3s, beginning, middle, end, gold, silver, bronze. 3 is manageable. You can wake up with those 3 missions in your head and have total clarity for the day ahead.
Now here's the next really critical shift. Most of us try to plan our day by the clock, right? We create these rigid hour-by-hour schedules that we can never, ever stick to. A much more effective way to do it is to plan your day based on your natural energy levels. You're not a robot. Your productivity goes up and down. The principle is super simple. You just map your tasks to your energy. For most of us, our energy is at its peak in the morning. So that's when you tackle your most important mission, the deep, creative work. You eat the frog. Then, as your energy starts to dip, you shift to less demanding stuff, like answering emails. And in that classic afternoon slump, you handle the low-energy tasks. You're working with your biology, not fighting against it.
So, you've got your psychological tools and you've got your daily plan. But what happens when, right in the middle of the day, your motivation just disappears? This next part is your real-time toolkit for handling those slumps that we know are going to happen. When you hit a wall, just stop and ask yourself this one simple question. This is the first and most important diagnostic test because the solution is completely different depending on your answer.
The test for genuine fatigue is really simple. Could you lie down on a couch without your phone and be asleep in 5 minutes? If the answer is yes, you are truly tired. The solution is a 20-minute power nap. Don't fight it, just take it. But if the answer is no, if you're just kind of restless and antsy, then the issue isn't fatigue, it's motivation. And that leads us right to our next step. You know, a lot of the time, a lack of motivation is really just a symptom of being overwhelmed. The task just feels so huge that you don't even know where to begin. The solution? Break it down into the smallest possible pieces you can imagine. Then, pick one and apply that 2-minute rule we talked about earlier. Just start for 2 minutes. See how this all connects? You're using your psychological tools to execute your daily plan.
And finally, to make real progress, you have to be honest with yourself. Kaizen Lane suggests tracking your effective work hours versus your planned hours. You might schedule 9 hours for work, but with all the procrastination and distractions, you might only be getting 4 hours of real, actual work done. Tracking this gap makes the problem visible and measurable. The goal isn't to work more hours, it's to close that gap and make the hours you do work really count.
And that brings us to the final and most important mindset shift. The goal of all these systems and rules isn't to create the perfect productive day. That's impossible. The goal is to build a sustainable system for consistent long-term progress. And this is the key takeaway of the entire thing. You're not going to magically transform overnight. Real, lasting change comes from applying these small actions consistently. Each time you use the 2-minute rule, each day you apply the rule of 3, you're delivering a little shock to your old system of procrastination. And over time, all those small shocks add up to a complete revolution in your productivity.
So let's make this real. Forget about tomorrow, forget about next week. Right now, what is the one single 2-minute action you can take to add a tiny weight to the discipline side of your identity scale? That gap between your dreams and your actions, it isn't some giant canyon you have to leap across. It's a bridge that you build, one small step at a time. The only question left is, what's your first step?